Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Movie Magpies, where we will be discussing the movie Paddington. I am Monique, as always, here with my co-host Will. How about we just get right into it?
So ultimately, hopefully, if you're tuning into the in-depth conversation or discussion, you will know what Paddington's about. But of course, if you don't, we always provide a summary. I don't think there are any warnings for anything to warn you about if you haven't watched Paddington, because ultimately this is a pretty wholesome film. But for people who don't know, what is Paddington?
The Netflix summary for Paddington is: rescued from a train station, Paddington Bear finds a haven with a London family, until a taxidermist decides to add Paddington to her collection. We discussed this already, but it's not the best summary that we've seen.
Absolutely not.
Kind of removes the heart of the film.
Yeah.
But ultimately, despite the mentions of taxidermy, this is a very PG film. It is definitely directed towards children, so you should be fairly okay to listen to us talk about it in depth.
Yeah, and quickly, warning for spoilers, as we will no longer hold back as we talk in depth about this film. Ultimately, if you want a spoiler-free conversation around Paddington, then you're more than welcome to go check out the review, but here we will be spoiling it at any point, and we want to just warn you prior, so then we have kind of immunity if something is ruined for you.
When we say spoiler warning, not just for Paddington.
No,
we have been known to spoil other movies while talking in the in-depth just because we want to make a comparison, so
and sometimes it doesn't work without the comparison, and we have to spoil things anyway because we've dug ourselves into a bit of a hole there. But
it's an in-depth, anything can happen.
Yeah, pretty much. But anyway, let's kind of talk in depth about it.
Let's dive right in.
So I think that... Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
No, you go. I was just going to start with a quick question for you, as
Sure.
I always have questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my question for you straight away is, why is no one shocked that a talking bear is walking around London?
That is a good question, because ultimately in this film, Paddington kind of wanders around most of London, and people are not like, oh shit, there's a bear, someone call animal control, or how the fuck did a bear that small and that sweet get into London? People are more just like, it's a bear. On with my day. And what I find really, really funny is that right at the start, Mr. Brown goes, everybody, eyes front, there's a bear over there. He's probably going to try and sell us something. And I think ultimately the answer to the question, why is no one shocked that there's a bear around London, is that this film is built in almost a separate universe where bears like this aren't necessarily astoundingly weird, or this isn't an astoundingly weird occurrence. But beyond that, I think the easiest answer for it is this is a movie for kids, and if we are stuck in situations where people are getting freaked out because they see a bear, then we're not going to be able to progress the story without having to address that every single time. So the film's ability to just not address it and then not take that point seriously is a really good point in its favor, because it never has to address that point, and as a result it can move on.
Of the movie as a whole,
the
fact that we aren't ever, oh my god, it's a bear that talks, means not just is the story progressing a lot smoother than it would if we had to stop every 5 seconds to be shocked that the bear talks.
Or explain why a bear's in London.
It also just adds to the whimsical nature of this film. This is a truly whimsical film. I said it in our review, but it's like a warm hug watching this film. It is just wholesome. It's got that nostalgic quality, even if you didn't... Well, obviously, it was made in 2014, so a lot of people wouldn't have grown up with it. But it still feels
unless they
like
grew up with the actual books, of course.
Well, if you grew up to the actual books. But as someone who never had the Paddington books, it's so nostalgic. And I've never experienced anything of Paddington until I was well into my adult life, so
absolutely.
Quite an interesting vibe.
And what I also find interesting, and what I couldn't talk about in the review but can talk about in the in-depth, is that it does have this beautiful wholesomeness to it that feels like a warm hug or having a warm blanket wrapped around us. But it also has moments in this film that are so perfectly crafted that it feels like it's punching your heart out, where you see Paddington either in trouble miserable or sad or, heartbroken, and you feel it too, where Paddington is out on the streets trying to find the explorer, and he's just getting nowhere, so he's like sleeping on park benches and stuff like that, and you feel so much of that pain. And
I don't think I have been that emotionally attached to a character.
You just want to make sure Paddington's safe the whole way through the film.
I just get so upset for that tiny little baby bear.
Because he's just so wholesome and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's great about his writing is that he's never too gullible or naive. He's always kind and innocent, but it's not a weakness, because he has, ultimately what is used quite well is that he has this hard stare that he only ever uses when people have forgotten their manners. Oh, it's fucking great when it's used in this film, because it's just
I absolutely love it so much.
Yeah, it's just great because he just slowly looks just angry, and then it's still kind of cute for the audience.
It's not even quite angry. It's just this intensity.
Yeah.
Which is really, really funny.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't feel like he's mad so much as he's just trying really, really hard to glare at you.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't have a mean bone in his body, but
as a result,
he's got to stare at you like this.
Yeah, it also allows us to ensure that the audience takes Paddington seriously as well in points, and that he's not just a doormat as well. He has his own motivations, and his motivations can push him to being strong-willed at points in the story, and he's not just a victim or even a civilian who needs to be protected at all times. You want to protect him, but that's because of so much more than just because he is a small bear in an unfamiliar land.
I think what really stands out to me in this is that even when Paddington makes a mistake, e.g. the bathroom scene, which it's always going to make me slightly uncomfortable, just the toothbrush thing.
Oh, the toothbrush is in his ears.
I don't think I can ever get over that, but I really, really like this scene because he doesn't know how to use these things, and he is left to his own devices in that room. He doesn't come out and go, "Oh my gosh, I apologize so much. I can't believe I did that. What can I do to help fix it?" He goes, "Oh, sorry, had a spot of bother with the facilities," or something along the lines of.
He still tries to remain civil.
But he doesn't immediately go, "Oh, I've completely ruined everything. It's all my fault. What can I do?" And it actually isn't until later in the movie, when he overhears a conversation between the parents, that he decides to leave the family because he's a burden to them. Which is what I really like about this film is, yes, Paddington makes mistakes, but he doesn't immediately get punished for them. There are consequences to his actions, e.g. the water going everywhere, or the papers that had all of the names of the explorer on it getting burnt, but
they aren't
there's
permanent
never
consequences.
there's never anybody turning around and going, "You're out of control, you're a wild animal," like da 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 da. Like, yes, people
you
call
need
him
to
a
be
wild
more
bear,
this and this or whatever.
but no one ever faults him for trying something and not knowing how it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, one of the main things that they have is, "You can tell us the truth, we won't be mad, we just want to know what happened." Which is such a really good lesson for children, that you can make mistakes, and it shouldn't always be the be-all, end-all. It shouldn't always be this really large punishment if you very genuinely accidentally did something.
Yeah, and I do truly think that Paddington does present that theme really well. That in a world where you can be honest with your mistakes, and the consequence will, of course, there will always be a consequence, but you're aware of the consequence, and you can handle the consequence because it's not been blown out of perspective or overly exaggerated, and people treat Paddington in a way that isn't like he is a child. They treat him like he's a guest in a city that he doesn't know. And as a result, it allows Paddington to be this character who has growth but doesn't change himself completely, and doesn't lose track of who he is at any point in the film. And the crisis point isn't about him becoming a new self or returning or regressing to his old self. It's about him finding a place to belong and then realizing that he belonged there all along. But then also it allows us to it allows us to be endeared to the Browns without ever being at a point where we actually disagree with their reactions and actions towards Paddington, even when Paddington makes a mistake, because Paddington actively chooses the consequences of his mistakes as well, which is also what is really great, because Paddington comes across as a fully realized character throughout the film anyway, and as a result, when he leaves, it's because he chose to leave and not because they kicked him out, in which that would be an action where you would hate a certain member of the Brown family if they made that decision, but none of them ever do, so ultimately we can still like the Browns as a result of that.
And it was actually one of the things that I was worried about going into this movie, specifically because Mr. Brown, the father of this family that takes in Paddington, kept mentioning and was quite adamant that Paddington couldn't stay with them. Like, he never kicked him out, but he definitely very openly didn't want him to stay with the family.
Yeah, he didn't appreciate his presence there.
Yeah,
and I
he's
think
one
this
of
is
the
a perfect time
standout
to talk
characters
about
for
Mr.
me.
Brown as well.
He's one of the more standout characters for me, moving into a discussion of him, like you said, because he is one of the other characters that has a character arc. Now, I understand that the children get a little bit of a minor character arc where the daughter goes from thinking that being weird is the most uncool thing ever to embracing it.
Which I do want to talk about at some point, but let's
let's
not get distracted.
But with Mr. Brown, he goes from being this risk analyst who is almost petrified by the idea of his children getting hurt to walking on the window ledge of a X amount of story building to save a bear that he originally thought was too much of a risk to have around his family. It's a really heartwarming character arc where he sort of embraces risk
embraces the risk for
love of his found family.
And what I find really, really interesting and nice is also that even at the beginning of the film where we're introduced to Mr. Brown, he's never a character that you outwardly do not relate to, in that you can understand why he's acting the way he is. He's very careful and almost paranoid, but because he cares so much for his family that he is petrified of any of them being hurt, and as a result he may have taken an exaggerated leap towards overprotectiveness, for sure, and that he's become kind of a helicopter parent. But you can still almost respect that because he doesn't even overstep his bounds in terms of the family. He still lets Paddington come and stay with them. He is still polite to Paddington, even right at the start where he sits with Paddington and they pay for a meal for him and he stays and chats with him and stuff like that. He's still very polite and cordial and reasonable as a character right from the start, but you also recognize his fault, and it's a fault that is almost a fatal fault for his character because he needs to grow and overcome that, and he does, and it makes him a greater character.
What I really love about Mr. Brown as a character is that he doesn't come across as protecting or the helicopter parent because he wants to control his children. He really does truly just seem like a parent who got stuck in that sort of new parent phase where every cough and every sniffle is a run to the doctors.
Absolutely.
And I really love that characterization of, you used to be a big risk taker, but the second that you had a child, it suddenly wasn't worth it, and it was almost terrifying to put yourself through that risk in case you couldn't be there to then mitigate risk for your own child. It's really heartwarming that his fatal flaw doesn't come from him being a bad parent, but
it
just
doesn't come from
him
a
being
selfish point.
An overly caring one, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm genuinely surprised that, not unpleasantly surprised, but I am surprised that Mr. Brown was one of your what you found one of your most compelling characters, because I wouldn't have pinned that for you, honestly.
Really? You didn't think that I would have liked Mr. Brown?
No, not so much that. I just definitely didn't think that you would have found him the most compelling, which isn't any kind of critique or anything like that, but I'm interested that you thought that he was kind of that interesting, and I do definitely see that as well, but it was just one of these little things that I didn't expect. But
were you expecting me to pick the mother as my favorite?
No, because here's the thing. I think that Mrs. Brown is fucking amazing, but also she doesn't necessarily have faults that are fatally...
She doesn't necessarily have faults in this movie.
Well, no, she does, but none that are actually, like, confrontable.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean, I suppose.
It gives her character depth, but it doesn't... They're not
she has
faults that actually make
give
her
depth,
weaker.
but she doesn't have faults in terms of the plot. She doesn't really do anything wrong or need to overcome anything. She's mostly in the right through this whole film, and there's only a couple times where she could be at fault, but they never really lead to anything plot-wise, which is why I say she doesn't really have faults.
Yeah, but what I do like about that is that with what you say that she is often in the right, it's never from a point where it feels contrived either. You get, because she is a genuinely caring, loving mother and person, she instantly cares for Paddington, and you get why she does, because of course who's not gonna love Paddington when they see him. But also a lot of her perspective at points does come across like she is along for the ride.
She's in terms
of an adventure.
Individual in this
well,
character.
no, not passive. She's definitely active, but her pursuit of what Paddington wants sometimes does come across like she's just following Paddington.
Which is what I mean when I say passive. It's not that she herself is a passive character within the story, but it's more, even with her children, she's quite go with the flow, I suppose. Her parenting style and the way that she treats Paddington is the same that she treats both her husband and her children. She's not trying to guide them to anything. They've made a decision, and she's trying her best to respect and almost emulate that decision within the household, which is really, really lovely. I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
No,
I'm just saying that Mr. Brown, of course, stands out to me as a compelling character. Specifically because he is more...
He has such a different change.
He's more active. In fact, one of my favorite scenes in the movie is when he walks away from Mrs. Brown while they're in the kitchen talking about Paddington, and she goes, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I'm doing my looking away stance."
Looking away stance,
Yeah, or something along the lines of, I can't remember the exact lines, and then it was like, "And now I'm doing my assertive voice," like because it shows, I'm doing my breathing, and I'm using my assertive voice, because it really showed that as a couple, despite their differences, they work and they are
and they're incredibly supportive of each other as well, which is really lovely.
He's very visibly upset, and she's not getting upset with him. She's like, "Oh, are you doing your breathing, darling?" You know, like, it's just so nice to see an on-screen couple that isn't completely at odds all the time. Yeah,
and what I find really, really compelling and interesting is that they're always depicted in a way in which they deal with their problems in a healthy and realistic way. This example is a really good one for sure, because it's where the husband, Mr. Brown, is very agitated and he needs to just calm down, and he doesn't just let out his anger at her because she's not at fault, he's not at fault. They're trying to discuss a problem, and that's also very much the source of where their dysfunction comes from, and how they handle it is that they always make it about the problem and not about each other, which is such a really healthy way of depicting issues when you're in a relationship. But even in the point where Paddington leaves, and you can't even really blame Mr. Brown for Paddington leaving, because it's instigated by discussion between Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown, but neither of them are at fault. But because Mrs. Brown is so distraught about Paddington leaving and her not knowing if he's okay or not, she can't talk to Mr. Brown. But it's not in a way in which she makes him sleep on the couch or she kicks him out of the house or anything like that, because ultimately he's still not at fault, and he shouldn't be made to feel that he's at fault. And because they're a healthy married couple, they still are around each other. She just can't talk to him, so she'll just take breaks away from him. And it's just such a interesting and really, really nice way of depicting this family that is just so healthy in terms of the way that they speak to each other. And even when, and we'll get to, what's the daughter's name again? You said it, I forgot it.
Did I say the daughter's name? I don't think I did.
I'll find it.
I think I just called her the daughter.
It's... Judy. Yeah,
That's
so Judy, even though she's like embarrassed by her mother, who is very open and vulnerable with her and excited about meeting Tony and all those kinds of things, Judy still expresses herself in a very healthy way, and she's willing to admit when she's wrong as well, which is such a strong way of depicting a character who is not even a teenager at this point. And now, as we get onto Judy, I think it's genuinely like both the kids both the actors who play them do a really damn good job. I personally think, but then also just with Judy, I think that she has a lot to really work with, in that she's depicted as a character who is quite smart and can pick up any language, which it doesn't feel unbelievable as well, because you believe it and you can support it. And then her big kind of, well, not big arc, but her arc within the film is that she's embarrassed by her family, and then she learns to accept that, or take the being weird in her stride. And I actually wanted to talk about this because that section itself does something incredibly well, in that it allows a character to embrace their uniqueness in a way that the Mitchells versus the Machines just couldn't fucking do.
Whoop, here we go.
And I'm not saying it in a way of just bashing on the Mitchells versus the Machines, though I do love to bash on the Mitchells versus the Machines.
Don't we all?
But I mean that in a way that one single character in this film is able to take on and embrace the uniqueness of themselves without parading it and championing it as if it's something that people need to feel lesser about. It's almost a point where the character accepts themselves, and it actually is cathartic for them, and they don't need to gloat about it or parade it, because it is something that is special to them, and keeping it special for them only helps enhance it, and it is only ever depicted in their actions. And I find that really, really remarkable, and it's just what I can't praise the writing enough for it, because the two kids have such intricate writing that they come across as real whole people, but then they also come across as aspirational kinds of people, in that as a kid, I would have wanted to be like either one of them.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that we've moved on to the kids now, because one of the nitpicks that I did have with this film, which, like I said, a lot of the nitpicks that I said this in the review, they're wholly inconsequential in the grand scheme of the movie. But I did find it quite interesting that in a film that is definitely directed to and focused towards an audience of children, that our two children characters don't really have much of a play in the story.
They definitely don't have prominence. I know what you mean. Yeah, they're not prominent. Well, they're not necessarily prominent in the story. They are in the story, and they're not necessarily the main focus, which I think is what you're getting at, is that they're not really the main focus.
It's not even that they're not the main focus. Judy gets her arc of embracing her weirdness, and the whole family is very unique in a way that makes them feel alive. The actors are of course quite young, and they do a really good job. It doesn't feel like they're stilted or they're struggling with their acting, which is really, really nice to see. But very specifically, they don't have much of a role in the storyline. Like I said, they're not very prominent within the film.
Yeah.
But specifically, Jonathan, I believe, is the
boy,
son.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah. He doesn't really have anything except for he's really good at making cool things with the safe toys that his father gave him.
Yeah.
And his father, eventually, after he goes through his character arc and learns that a little risk is sometimes good, wants to encourage that growth and that ability in him.
Well,
besides being very, very smart and sort of scientifically minded, he doesn't have a lot else going for him in the concept of the film.
Yeah, well, so here's my, to play devil's advocate, because ultimately with my point every single week is that you're allowed to have critiques of films, and it's totally fair for you to have critiques of it, but if you're not able to discuss the critique, then it's not a critique. So just as a devil's advocate for that point, what?
Oh, if you can't discuss the critique and you just go, well, I still think it's bad, you're just being rude.
Then it's just, exactly,
being
I think
controversial.
Yeah, to play devil's advocate for this point, I think the kids, though they don't necessarily have specific agency within the film, I don't think it's necessarily needed for them to, because ultimately the basis of the arcs or the conflict within the story is about keeping Paddington with the Browns, and that decision the main decisions specifically wholly lie on the parents. So as a result, within the film, the children don't necessarily have the same agency, but because they are unique and different characters and people, they can still contribute to the aid of the crisis and the climax and the pursuit of the plot, for sure. So I do get what you mean, and I totally agree that they don't have a whole lot in the film, but ultimately I don't think they necessarily need to either.
No, and really, like I said, it's wildly inconsequential in the grand scheme of the film, because of course our childlike figure for the for the children watching, not the characters, for the children watching to relate to and sort of grasp onto as someone to emulate is Paddington. That's the point of Paddington, is that he is the stand-in for the child in the movie. And we've spoken about how, because he's the stand-in for a child in the movie, that I really love the way that they treat him like a small adult or a guest in a city that he doesn't know,
it's really
rather
nice,
than a silly little bear who can't get anything right. Like, it is very much a good way to treat a stand-in for a child in a movie with respect. Like, they're tiny humans, they just don't know everything that we do, and they need to be taught it so that they can then emulate it in their everyday life. I really, really like that, which is why it doesn't particularly bother me that the kids don't have agency within the story so much, but it is still something that I wanted to bring up, because you do notice it.
It's worth talking about, for sure. I think as a final point to talk about, we want to talk about the antagonists just a little bit, because without villains there aren't really heroes and all that jazz, but I know there are definitely other characters who we could talk about to death. I think specifically Mr. Gruber, I love his presence within the film, and I love his line that I think it's that my body was here in London, but my heart took a little longer to get here, and it's such a beautiful little line. That
so
deserves so much focus. But ultimately, I want to talk about the villains, because they also have very decent writing put into them, that they feel believable that they would be pursuing Paddington, because one of which is a taxidermist who is looking to reinstate her family's fame and legacy, because her father chose not to reveal the location of the spectacled bear and lost his membership to the Geographers Guild.
Yeah, he almost lost his
So you get the reason why she is so ride or die to get Paddington and stuff him and put him on display. And I think Nicole Kidman does a really good job, our own Nicole Kidman.
Nicole Kidman is ridiculously good at being extravagant but still compelling villains.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
For lack of a better word. I mean, the other time that I really think she's stand out, even though I don't particularly like the Golden Compass movie as a whole.
Oh, right, yeah.
I think that she did really well in the Golden Compass movie.
Yeah, she plays a very compelling villain.
Compelling villain with that same sort of extravagancy. It's a different type of extravagancy, but she's playing a very over-the-top villain in that movie as well, and she just does it really well. She has this presence to her that makes it seem so believable, despite it being a bit more eccentric.
Yeah, and like, of course, she's great in the role. I also think that a lot of her on-site kind of gags are also really great, that she is a taxidermist, but then also within the Natural History Museum, her office is on the other side of the wall of animal heads, but then on her side in the office there are a bunch of all of the animals' asses on the other side, which is just a really solid joke to do with the taxidermy, because I don't doubt that many kids will have seen like mounted heads and gone, is the ass on the other side? Because I definitely did as a kid.
The humor itself, I know that we are talking about the villains, so not to derail us, but the humor itself is so accessible.
Oh,
it's not derogatory. It doesn't put anything down to make its humor. And even when it is kind of making fun of British people as a whole, it's a movie made very much for the British, in a way, I suppose.
It's humor that is also never steps over the line to being just humor for the parents who've brought the kids or just humor for kids, and it never steps into the gratuitous humor that seems to plague kids movies. Like, I think there is one fart joke in this whole movie, and it's when Paddington's eaten a bunch of marmalade inside the boat, and then he leans over to fart, and then it's just a foghorn because the ship has reached land. And that's the one fart joke that's in the whole movie, and it's great because it never relies on jokes like that, like other films.
It never relies on crude humor. It never relies on humor that puts either the children watching or the adults who brought their children to this movie down. Like, it's very, like I said, accessible humor. It just makes you feel welcomed. Nothing about the humor makes you go, oh, that was a little off color. Like, it's all very, very above board. And still incredibly amusing. Like, the amount of times that I just was giggling through this film.
It was real. It was really good humor.
Rare for me to giggle at a film. So.
I think just before we get too far off topic, I'll just bring up Mr. Curry, who's the secondary antagonist, who I really like. So he's played by Peter Capaldi, and I think his character serves as a really good secondary antagonist because he actually has no intention of causing any harm to Paddington, but he just doesn't like Paddington because ultimately he might bring down the property value of the neighborhood.
Having a bear live in your street is really good for.
And I find him really nice because he is ultimately, at the end of the day, he is just a flawed human being, but who is not beyond redemption, in that when he finds out that Nicole Kidman's character, Millicent Clyde, is gonna stuff Paddington, he's horrified.
And the one issue that I did have with his character as a whole is they did kind of lean a little bit heavily on the, I'm not particularly gonna question what you're doing because you're pretty and you're showing me attention. But they do redeem it at the very end where he does realize that she was in fact going to taxidermy Paddington, not just send him back to Peru.
He goes
that he
out of his way to
immediately
help.
goes to rectify his mistake, albeit in a quite funny way where he's very adamant on trying to keep his anonymity, even though Mr. Brown
already knows
sees right through it and doesn't even question it. Oh, it's our neighbor doing a silly voice. No, it's not. I'm not your neighbor. What are you talking about? But I really, really like that they sort of lent on that, oh, she's pretty, so I'll do whatever I need to for her. And then when he actually turned around and realized that she wasn't as, I suppose, wholesome as he was expecting.
As
when
pretty
she
on the
seems
inside as she was on the outside.
That's a very good way of putting it. When he realizes that she has more sinister intentions for Paddington, he isn't like, oh, well, you showed me affection and I really want your love, so I'm going to keep with it. He goes, no, that's wrong.
That's not okay.
It was a mistake to help you. And I really like that even as a character who is an old grumpy man who you would assume would be set in his ways, he also has that sort of redeeming moment. There aren't a lot of hateable characters in this film. I would say there's not any hateable
I don't think there are
characters.
any hateable characters in this film at all. Because all of them have this delightful kind of whimsy to them, which makes them all really enjoyable. And I think that naturally really pushes us to the next point that I did want to talk about, is just that the writing is so genuinely well done that everything in this film feels intentional, and it kind of brings me on to the point of the Chekhov's gun and the use of it in Paddington, which is, need I remind you again, a children's film, but its use of Chekhov's gun is almost a masterclass of writing.
It really, truly is one of the funniest Chekhov's guns that I've seen around. And
its use of Chekhov's gun is absolutely impeccable.
Well, it's done really, really well, but it's also got this humor to it, which you wouldn't expect, because usually people are like, oh, look, this isn't important, and we're going to bring it up later. How smart are we? But it's like, lol, bird.
It never lampshades us, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that you brought on the bird one, because the pigeons are very much a Chekhov's gun throughout the film, in that they're constantly brought back up because they're aware that he's got a marmalade sandwich under his hat, which is also a Chekhov's gun. And both of these things become evident that they're going to be used later.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that I really like is there's a lot of stuff that is set up and then paid off on, such as the kids' talents, that Judy learns how to speak bear, and then Jonathan learns about a great deal of sciences through the safe kits and stuff like that.
Minded.
But one of the ones that I do like is that Mrs. Bird, who we haven't talked about, she's great, but Mrs. Bird has a collection of vacuum cleaners, and that goes hand in hand with ultimately no Chekhov's gun in Paddington is without its second part, because they're almost dual wielding Chekhov's guns for sections, and
they all have dual purposes.
Yeah, they have, well, not dual purposes, but almost two Chekhov's guns go in together to make a big Chekhov's gun, one of which being that it's established very early on that Paddington is a very light bear, and then partway through the film, when we see him handling one of the dustbusters, it appears that it can pretty much carry his weight, and then in the final confrontation, he manages to get out of a near-death situation because he climbs a vent using dustbusters as magnets on the walls. And it's just because we're introduced to these concepts throughout the film, and they're just like, first time you see them, you're like, oh, these are just stupid jokes, but they're a lot of fun, and then they pay off in the end, and it feels so much more gratifying to see that happen. And it's just such a testament to the writing that it does that. And before we get on to my pointless research, which is a little bit away from all of this kind of talk, but it still relates to Paddington because it's the history of Paddington, if you didn't know. But one thing I also found really incredible about this film is that the cinematography accommodates Paddington, despite him being a bear that doesn't exist.
I really do want to talk about the cinematography.
Yes, we have
to. But before we move too far away from the Chekhov's gun sort of foreshadowing areas, when I said lol bird, I very specifically didn't say pigeon, because one of my favorite things in this movie is that yes, we have the marmalade sandwich that attracts all the pigeons, which almost knock our taxidermist off the roof. But what I really, really love about this is that it's like, oh yeah, the birds liked the sandwich. And then the final finishing blow that sort of knocks her off the roof and she grabs onto the flagpole, because of course this is a PG movie and no one gets hurt.
Dies. Yeah. Oh wait, no, that's
no
not true.
one even really gets hurt.
No, that's not true either.
The pin.
Well, someone dies. Spoiler, Uncle Pastuzo dies.
It's like in the first 5 minutes, we haven't mentioned it. But I really, really love that in the birds almost knocking her off, it's Mrs. Bird that then comes and delivers that finishing blow.
That is actually
keeping within
a really
the theme
point,
of the birds there. And God,
sometimes
that's why
this film is just a little too clever for its own good, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's exactly why I said this is such a humorous use of Chekhov's gun in this film, is that they're like, oh, all of the pigeons come and almost knock her off the roof, but she's not quite not a threat yet. Lol.
Yeah.
Mrs. Bird.
Yeah, Mrs. Bird, and that knocks her off. Yeah, that is good. Yeah, but as we talk about that, and we'll get onto the cinematography, because ultimately I'm a cinematographer, I feel like we kind of have to talk cinematography in every single podcast.
Talk about them camera angles.
But yeah, so this film does so much that in points there is cinematography specifically used to accommodate Paddington's movement and mannerisms within it, and there are sections of the film that give Paddington a realistic or textbook amount of headroom. So one of the classic techniques for cinematography is a term called headroom, in which if you give a character too much headroom, it creates a sense of unease. If you bring it down just to like almost a few centimeters above their head, that's probably the perfect amount of headroom to give them, where it doesn't feel claustrophobic, but it feels like there is not too much space above their head, and they accommodate Paddington's height well in those sections, and then in other sections they use the camera and move the camera in a way in which Paddington can naturally move around the scene without it being unconventional.
Or stilted in a way.
Yeah, or stilted, and it's incredible.
Another thing that I find really, really nice about this is, of course, because he's CGI, it would be very easy to resize him to make the scene look the way that you specifically
scene
want it.
work. Or
But
just
not
move him
once,
somewhere where he would fit.
exactly, but not once does it feel like they've moved him for the sake of making the shot work properly.
Yeah.
And he's also never disproportionately sized in any of these
No.
shots. Like, for filming what is essentially a stuffy and a tennis ball on a stick for the CGI work, they've done a really, really good job of making him proportionate. They never change his size comparatively to the other characters.
I don't think the CGI ever accommodates the cinematography. I think the cinematography is always set to accommodate the CGI, and I think that's how it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately we want to make films that look great, but we also do need to understand that a character is going to stand in this specific spot. So we want to make it seem like that was intentional, that they were standing there, and not just move them to a point so that they fit in frame.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing. It's really nicely done. One shot I do actually want to bring up is that they actually use a Dutch angle at one point, and it's a a tilt into a Dutch angle, and it almost... At first you're like, wait, why are they doing this? And then it stops, and it stops at a point where you can see the top windows of the neighborhood, and you can see Mr. Curry lean out without having to cut to the window.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a perfect use of the Dutch tilt in a way where it introduces Mr. Curry as a sense of unease in our first meeting with him. And it's perfect. It's a perfect use of visual symbolism for a character who exists
Love
there.
a good Dutch angle.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great use of it because it's not overly stylized to the point where it feels like...
It's not like, oh, we're tilting, everything's
cheesy,
going off kilter.
yeah.
You're just kind of like, why are we... Oh, to see the top of the building. Oh, there's a person in the window. You know, it all flows very nicely. And of course, like you said, it does create that sort of... This is a character that we should be wary of. He's a bit uneasy.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't do that to an extent where it's like, look, this man is an antagonist.
Do not trust this man. He is evil,
Let me smack you over the head, you know?
Yeah. And I'm recognizing what we have for time, so before we get on to our final thoughts, I might quickly just bring up our pointless research. I don't have a natural segue into this one, sadly. But since we've been talking so much about the film, I thought, just like with our previous pointless research where I gave you a little insight into the behind the scenes, I thought I'd give you guys an insight into the history of Paddington Bear. So this week's pointless research is the history of Paddington. So, starting off, Paddington was first a character written by British author Michael Bond. Paddington's first appearance was in October 1958 in a children's book titled A Bear Called Paddington. So Paddington is almost 70 years old as a character.
He's an old man.
Well, he's not an old man. He's a character who's been around for 70 years.
He's baby, but also old.
Since then, he has been featured in over 20 books. So that's just a quick kind of outline to his kind of world. He very quickly became a classic British character. However, Michael Bond came up with his character because he is based on a trip Michael Bond took once, in which he found a lone bear sitting on a shelf in a London store near Paddington Station. This bear, specifically, he bought as a present for his wife on Christmas Eve in 1956. The first Paddington story was written in 10 days after this idea had come about. What's interesting is that book became quickly popular to the point where toys were starting to be made of him, and multiple other books, of course. But what I found interesting about the toy specifically is that the prototype of this toy was manufactured by a company called Gabriel Designs, which was actually just a small business run by a Shirley and Eddie Clarkson. So it may seem like that's not important, but it actually does have a real world connection. So the prototype of this toy was given to their children, Shirley and Eddie Clarkson's children, as a Christmas present. So if you have caught on around about now,
he was a present.
He was a present, but it gets a little more deep and a little more interesting than that. So their children were named Joanna and Jeremy. And if you find one of those names familiar, then you'd actually be correct in your assumption, because one of those people to receive the very first prototype of a Paddington Bear was in fact Jeremy Clarkson, the famous host of Top Gear. Yeah, so I found that incredibly interesting. The original version of Paddington Bear also had Wellington boots to ensure that he could stand upright. So, yeah, so the toy actually also has a very synonymous connection to British history, which is quite interesting.
And he was a gift twice.
Yeah, so more on from that, his storyline, so the story of Paddington Bear, is partially inspired by the children who would be sent away from London during World War II, as Paddington classically carried a tag asking for others to please take care of this bear, and eventually went on to inspire a moral of kindness and compassion towards those looking for help. All of Paddington's stories were specifically written to be standalone and not linearly divided or part of a big story arc, so the intention was to allow for children to enjoy the stories without needing to collect them in any sort of order. So it had a grand kind of approachableness for the stories. There were multiple TV series adaptations throughout the years, with a few film adaptations. However, 2014's Paddington was the first time Paddington had been made in live action. Paddington has since earned great acclaim all around the world, with some accolades including his face on stamps in both 1994 and 2006, a Paddington-themed hotel in Lawrence Block's The Burglar and the Rye, which is a book, not a real place. He was a balloon at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in 2014, and eventually he became the face of Robertson's Gold Shred Marmalade. So
he's on a jar of marmalade.
Well, he's the face of Marmalade for Robertson. So it's really interesting to see how much joy and happiness was started from a little bear left on a shelf outside Paddington Station. What I also find interesting, and this is just a little piece of trivia, the original writer for the Paddington stories, Michael Bond, actually has a cameo in Paddington as a kindly gentleman.
He does?
He does. At some point in the film, he makes an appearance.
And you're not going to tell me when?
I don't know when. Look, my pointless research is on the history, not the right now.
Oh, I thought with the amount of times you'd watched this film that you would have been able to pick it.
I can't because I'm not an observant man.
He says as we review and observe films.
But with that all said, that is kind of the history of Paddington Bear as a whole. I think it is a really beautiful story, learning about him as a character.
Oh my god, I'm obsessed with this tiny little bear. I want a stuffed little Paddington now.
Well, you never know. Christmas is right around the corner. But anyway.
We might get into our final thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's time to get into our final thoughts.
Now that we've done our bit of trivia, did you have any or many final thoughts on this one?
I think one of the things I did want to talk about is that, because we haven't really talked about the color palette, the color palette is just wonderfully vibrant and injects so much life and light into every single scene. A thing I talked about in the review is that no character is actually given a dull color palette of clothing as well. In that, I think Mr. Brown probably comes across as the most careful and concerned character, but he's not made to wear greys and blacks. Instead, they choose to go for a majority of beige, which is still a color, but then also detail and highlight it with reds and various other colors, and it gives him a great breath of life without having to dull his character down visually, so that they can make his character a little more concerned and protective in writing. Yeah. And I think that's really wonderful. I also think that I do find it really, really lovely that no scene is ever devoid of vibrant color.
Yeah.
And as a result, it gives this film a very child-friendly and welcoming presence to it. In a way that it does.
Even the dark scenes have adequate lighting.
Yeah.
To still be friendly and not more in that spooky area of things.
Yeah, the only scenes that actually have any sort of sinisterness are definitely the scenes with the taxidermist, in which there is some surgical kind of white rooms and then also darker, almost sickly greens at points, but it is to highlight the not evil, but the definitely sinister nature of her work.
Yeah.
And I do like that. And I do actually find it really quite refreshing that this is a film that doesn't actually rely so heavily on color theory to purvey emotion and mood. It uses color as a means to express the heart of the film, which is joy and the wholesomeness that comes with Paddington's story.
I also really like that the father, Mr. Brown, is sort of in that more beigey colour, but it really is a warm brown beige. It's not that sort of like more white beige, so he feels just as vibrant as the rest of the characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also, as we were talking about colour theory, think it's funny that his supplementary colour is red.
Yeah.
And he wears a little bit more of it at the end of the film in the sort of like winter
Yeah.
scene. But before that scene, when they're in the archives trying to get the information on the Explorer, he wears that sort of pink cleaner's uniform.
A strong
And then
pastel
slowly
pink.
gets more red put into his outfits, which I think is
Yeah, I
quite
do
funny that
like
he
that.
almost evolved into the red again.
Yeah, I do also like the kind of symbolism that his wife, Mrs. Brown, wears a lot of red as well, and it almost feels like he's coming back to a point where he's with her more than he was before. And not saying that because ultimately we have praised the wholesomeness and the healthiness of their relationship to death, but ultimately it also helps in that he comes to realize his mistakes and comes to grow as a person when he's accepted the full red of his clothes.
And it almost adds to the cohesion of their relationship.
Yeah.
They look more like a unit, more like a pair.
And I think as we're kind of starting to eke out our final points, there is one scene I do want to talk about very specifically because I spoke to you about it as we were watching it, and it never fails to give me goosebumps because it's blatant on the nose symbolism, but it's done in such a wholesome and beautiful way that it can't be faulted. And it's right at the start when Paddington has been at the train station all day, introducing himself to people who are passing by and they just ignore him, and the Browns finally pass by and he's standing outside the Lost and Found and only the Lost is illuminated. But then when Mrs. Brown comes back and speaks to him and he looks up at her and she talks to him with such a kind, wonderful tone that it's just really sweet and wholesome, and she's also illuminated by the shop front window. But then the Found of the Lost and Found wall
lights up as well.
Lights up as well. And it's just such a sweet and so wholesome little moment because you know that no matter what happens through this film, that's his family. And that's his, that's going to be his family. It's not gonna matter what happens in the film, and you're given this almost comforting assurance that he's not going to be abandoned and he's actually going to be taken care of and he has found his family, and it's just so sweet and so lovely. And also with the history that I have illuminated to you all now, it also becomes all the more wholesome because he's out the front of a store where the original Paddington was found. Not the same store, I can never pin that down specifically, but it has the same symbolism there, and it's just so sweet and wholesome.
I do like, and this is one of my final thoughts actually as we sort of wrap up here, I do love how closely and faithfully this movie stays to the heart of Paddington as a story, as a character, as a tiny little bear that was a Christmas present. They do a really, really good job of conveying his history without outright telling you.
Yeah.
And I truly do adore this movie. I think there's something to be said about movies that hit that nostalgic sort of niche without just doing it for a cash grab, that actually managed to do it and stay so faithful to the original vibes and heart of a character. I've had a couple nitpicks, but I really don't have anything truly bad to say about this movie, and a lot of the nitpicks that I do have, I could play devil's advocate myself for them and explain them away. So
I think one of my last points I want to bring up before we close out is that I recently read that originally, before Ben Whishaw, the voice of Paddington, was chosen for Paddington, they had originally set Colin Firth to voice Paddington, and I think they, no shade to Colin Firth, but I think they really dodged a bullet there. Because I think Colin Firth's voice carries too much authority and age and wisdom that would have, in theory, made Paddington so much less endearing.
It's also interesting to me that Colin Firth is also from the same vein of movies as, of course, our voice of Paddington.
Ben Whishaw, yeah.
Yep, Ben Whishaw, thank you. I never remember his name.
He's great.
Yeah, but I do love that they've sort of gone, oh, we'll take one of you from this specific film franchise. There's a lot of well-known names in this. It's really, if you know a British actor, you'll probably see them in this.
Yeah, because there are 4 actors who have been in Harry Potter and Paddington.
Mm-hmm.
That number increases with Paddington 2. There are also 2 characters who were in Horrible Histories in Paddington as well.
You get a Doctor Who cameo.
You get a Doctor Who cameo. I think that doubles as well in Paddington 2. I think pretty much every cameo from a different series doubles in Paddington 2. But that's because it's so prominent with the British presence in film, which is great because ultimately it works. So there's no critique there. But I think with all that said, I think we should probably close out our pod.
Definitely. Please do give a like to this podcast. Let us know what you think. Give us some feedback. If you'd like to reach out to us on separate platforms, I am at Nexitai on both Instagram and Twitter, and Will is Will_Mortlock on Instagram and Grey Mouse Inc. on Twitter. I am much more active on Twitter, and Will is much more active on Instagram, so you have a bit of a choice of which platform you'd like to interact with us on. I do weekly hint refreshes on Twitter where we have a couple people, replying to the tweet and guessing what the movie might be. And if you guess the movie correctly, you may get a poorly drawn picture of a trophy that William has drawn himself.
Big shout out to Lumen, who managed to guess last week's.
Yeah, he managed to guess Knives Out, which was incredibly funny. Yeah. And if you're really, really quick and you stalk my Twitter, you might even catch a mistake, because today I accidentally thought that we were posting Paddington, not recording Paddington. Yeah. So I was like, our last episode was on Knives Out. Here's the hint for Paddington, instead of doing it as the hint for Knives Out. So a couple eagle-eyed people might have caught that. Yeah. What is our hint, Will?
So, of course, the old hint, if you didn't get it, was another film where our hero feels like an outsider among very different people, but their behavior towards such discontent is definitely given pause.
Little pause.
Little pause. So ultimately, if you got that with the hint to pause and alliteration, then good for you. If you didn't, as always, better luck next time, I guess. You're just not necessarily as smart as me, clearly.
Oh my gosh, William.
Working harder and harder to make myself an antagonist. I don't actually mean that, don't worry. You get another chance with this week's hint, which is, of course, another film where a beloved children's book gets adapted, which will require a chicken, a goose, and some apples, and even the cunning of a possum. So give that a few guesses. Let us know if you guess it.
I'm so excited to watch this movie and
yeah, so am I actually. I really do enjoy it, so I'm looking forward to hearing some guesses, I'm looking forward to watching it, and I'm looking forward to talking about it next week.
At any rate, that closes us out for tonight. Please do, like I said, give us some comments, even some feedback. We really, really love hearing from you guys. I hope you're all well, and goodbye.
Bye.